I need a hymnal. That was good. Thank you very much. Church, would you join me in your Old Testament in Genesis chapter 38, please? Get your bulletin out, turn it over, get a pencil or a pen. Are you like me? And sometimes you have to learn things the hard way. You don't have to raise your hand. I don't mind telling you that I've had several lessons along the way, more than I care to remember, where the Lord had to teach me the hard way. Some of us are like that, and some of us are like that in certain ways. We run into a gentleman this morning in our journey through the book of Genesis who had to learn some things the hard way. His name is Judah. In Genesis 38, verse 1, it says this: "At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira." Judah is one of the sons of Jacob, and Jacob, of course, is the grandson of Abraham. God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons who became the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. So Judah is one of these 12 brothers, but he leaves his brothers here in this part of Genesis to go down and stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. Adullam was southwest of Bethlehem. But this leaving of his brothers and going down is a bad portent. In Genesis, it means good things are probably not going to happen. Lot left Abraham and went down to Sodom and Gomorrah, and nothing good happened down there. Esau left and went down to Edom, and we saw a couple of weeks ago that he struggled. And so right at the very beginning when we read this, we ask ourselves, what's going to happen to Judah? Verse 2, "There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite." More literally, he saw the daughter of a Canaanite. And the narrator of the Bible is very careful in his choice of words. Sometimes our translators not so much. He was taken by her beauty, the sight of her. He saw the daughter of a Canaanite named Shua. Canaanite's name was Shua. The daughter, we never learn her name. He married her, and he lay with her. In other words, he slept with her, man and wife. Now, Abraham was very, very careful that Isaac would not marry a woman of Canaan because of the corrupt culture. And so he ensured that Isaac married within their extended family. Isaac did the same thing for Jacob for the same reasons. But Judah now, like some of the men in the family, as we've already seen, breaks this pattern. And he marries one of the girls who is living in this corrupt and spiritually dark culture around them, and it creates problems every time that it happens. You know, it amazes me how sometimes certain people end up together to be married. I love hearing stories, but sometimes I'm floored by how certain people end up together. One young lady's wedding made it into the news earlier this week. The reason is because in the middle of her wedding ceremony, her groom went into an epileptic fit. And so he was swept away to the hospital. And meanwhile, she got angry because he and his family did not divulge to her that he had this physical problem. And she was so angry that she looked around at all the men who were attending her wedding, and she said, "You, come here. I'm going to marry you." They had a little conversation. He was understandably surprised, but after a little while he was convinced. He wasn't necessarily dressed for the party, just had jeans and a leather jacket on, but he's the one she chose, and so they got married right there on the spot. Meanwhile, the original groom was feeling better, so he came back to find out that his bride had already married another man. And a conversation ensued between the two of them whereby he tried to change her mind, but she refused. And then there was a brawl, and the authorities had to show up. It's a pretty exciting day, actually. But my goodness, you know, that seems a little careless to me, does it to you? To choose your mate for the rest of your life. I think we need a better set of principles or guides to choose the person that we're going to spend the rest of our life with. Somebody that has kept himself in the news a lot, Rob Bell. You know, some of you remember him as the author of Love Wins, a book that essentially denies the existence of hell. and has now become the spiritual advisor for Oprah Winfrey. That should tell you everything you need to know about Rob, okay? But he made the news earlier this week talking about marriage and Christianity. He still considers himself to be a cutting-edge representative and spokesman for Christianity. I wish he'd stop that, but he's probably not going to. And he said that we as Christians, he includes himself, we just need to quit listening to these 2,000-year-old letters when it comes to marriage. In other words, put the Bible away. We don't need the Bible anymore. Well, I'm sorry, Rob. Yeah, we do. We need something that is unchanging. We need some kind of standard. We need some kind of rock to build our house on that we know comes from God because our hearts are fickle and the circumstances are crazy and wacky things happen. We need a strong foundation. Judah didn't realize that. He broke from the crowd and Judah's going to have some trouble. Here, let's write down 4 things this morning that Judah had to learn about the hard way. Number 1, what did Judah do wrong? Well, he married outside of God's people. He married outside of God's people. For those of you who are unmarried and you're going to be married in the future, let me say again, please, please, tell yourself now that at least that one standard is unbreakable. You will marry only a believer, only somebody of like mind when it comes to Christianity. But Judah's going to struggle here. Verse 3. She, his wife, became pregnant, gave birth to a son who was named Don't know where they got that name from. It wasn't out of a phone book, but there it is, Verse 4, she conceived again and gave birth to a name and called him Onan. I like that name better. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. I guess that was a male name back then, Shelah. And it was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Now Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and named her, her name was Tamar. He goes out and gets his own wife, but he won't let his son do the same thing. It's funny how people have these double standards. Tamar, whose name means date palm, is going to be an important player today. Her ethnicity is never disclosed, which is unusual because the writer of Genesis is so concerned about the ethnicity of the people who marry into God's family. We never learn here whether she is of the extended family or she is a Canaanite. Most commentators assume that she is a Canaanite. Verse 7, but Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Ouch! My goodness. Now that's a verse that'll just stop you right in your tracks. Whoa! There's been no mention of God in this narrative since chapter 35. Chapter 35, and here we are in chapter 38. His personal name, Yahweh, has not been mentioned since chapter 32. And here we have, you notice in your English Bible, Lord, little capital letters, so in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew Bible, this is Yahweh. It's God's personal name, so it's not even the generic name, El or Elohim. It's Yahweh. The narrator is almost as if he wants to shake us up. It said, oh, Yahweh come in here, found was wicked, and he put him to death. That shakes you up, doesn't it? And some people, these are one of those verses where some people say, well, the God of the Old Testament, he's an angry and a harsh God. The God of the New Testament, however, he's a loving and kind and a patient God. And if you happen to think that, and you get to this verse, and you're thinking, well, there's a reason for me to think that. There it is right there. Just later on today, when you have an opportunity, I want you to look up a story in the New Testament about a couple named Ananias and Sapphira. Ananias and Sapphira. And tell me how much God really changed between the Old Testament and the New Testament. He doesn't change. Not since Noah has God intervened with this kind of judgment. Not since Sodom and Gomorrah. But this time it's an individual. It's personal. Apparently there was some extreme wickedness going on here, and it's an indication of what kind of culture that Judah has married himself into. Verse 8, then Judah said to Onan, lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce an offspring for your brother. So we go from one hard verse to the next one. This is a strange thing for us. It's called the Levirate law, and the way that it worked in the ancient world was that if a man dies without having any children, any heirs, then his brother was required to sleep with his wife and to have a baby so that that line wouldn't die out, so that that man's name would not be forgotten in his family. And the baby that was produced belonged to the deceased man, not to the one who produced it. Now that's odd to us. And it wasn't just an Israelite custom. It was a custom in cultures generally in the ancient Near East. They were very concerned that nobody's line would die out. And so here, because dies without having any children, Judah just jumps in immediately. He follows the custom of his day, and he tells Onan, the younger brother, says, you need to go in and sleep with Tamar and have a baby for so that name isn't erased from the future. Verse 9, but Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. Man, another crazy verse. So Onan did have sex with Tamar, but he stopped just short. Okay, he used sort of a natural contraceptive here. He didn't mind sleeping with her and having sex, but he didn't want to have children because once his older brother died, he was the heir. Everything went to him after that. Why should he produce a child that's going to take it away from him? So, sleep with Tamar, have a good time, but protect what's yours. Here we go, verse 10. Still with me? What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death also. Dang! I can't tell you how much fun I had studying this text this morning. I can't tell you how many times I looked in the mirror and said, what in the world are you going to say Sunday morning, Richard? Now, this text has been used, unfortunately, to teach about masturbation. Some people have said, well, what Onan was doing was masturbating, and God killed him, and so that's why he shouldn't masturbate. Well, I didn't come here to talk to you this morning about masturbation, but let me just tell you that this text has nothing to do with masturbation, okay? He was having sex with Tamar. The reason that God killed him is because he refused to fulfill his duty. He would have sex, but he wouldn't produce a child. All right? So if you need to talk about masturbation, we'll do that another time. This is not it. He was abusing God's gift of human intimacy. God's command in the Old Testament is be fruitful and multiply. He didn't want to. And so he wasn't going to do it. God's promise to Abraham, and he's in the Abraham lineage now, he's the son of Judah, is I'm going to make you fruitful and multiply. Verse 11, Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, so here she is, she's had two husbands essentially. There's a third brother, Shelah still. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. Apparently he's too young to marry her at this point, for he thought he may die too, just like his brother. So Tamar went to live in his father's house. Now, Judah sent Tamar home, but she's really betrothed to Shelah, the way that this thing works. She's Shelah's, but they have to wait for him to grow up until he's old enough to marry her. But I want you to notice what's happening here. Judah is missing what's going on. Judah thinks that the reason his first two sons, and Onan, died was because Tamar has some sort of curse on her. And so he says, I need this woman out of my house. And he sends her back to her daddy. You go live with your father, and I'll call you. Don't call me. And when Shelah's old enough, my third son, I'll give you a call. But as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that he has no intention of doing that. He just wanted to get rid of her. He did not understand what was going on. He was living in the midst of wickedness. And it didn't even dawn on him that maybe God had intervened in what was happening. So here's the second thing on your outline. What did Judah do wrong? Well, he misinterpreted God's judgments. He misinterpreted God's judgment. He thought Tamar was cursed, but really, the two brothers were evil. And Judah apparently didn't even notice that. He was blind spiritually to what was going on in his own household. Verse 12. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. So he's lost two sons, and now he lives as his wife. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hiram the Adullamite went with him. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil. Note, she's still here wearing widow's clothes. Meanwhile, Judah has mourned his wife, and he's put back on his clothes to go out and party down where they're shearing the sheep, but he's leaving her, cooling her heels back at her daddy's house. Verse 14, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then went and sat down at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that though Shelah had grown up now, she had not been given to him as his wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she covered her face. Very surly story. Sheep shearing time was a festive time. There was a lot of drinking. Judah may have already been drunk. We don't know. He had recently lost his wife. Here's his daughter-in-law. He doesn't realize it, sitting in the red light district, open for business. Verse 16, not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you, she asked. Did Tamar know? She's laying a trap for him. That's obvious. Did she know that he had a weak moral character when it came to sexual issues? Was there something that she knew about this man that we don't, that caused her to think that this trap was going to work? Verse 17, I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until I send it? Until you send it, she said. Now, that's pretty generous. A young goat from the flock was worth a lot. And so he's paying for sex. At least he's willing to pay a lot. Verse 18, he said, what pledge shall I give you? Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her, and he slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. Now, what she asks for, his seal and his cord and his staff in his hand, indicates that he was probably a well-off gentleman. The seal was a precious stone that was like a little cylinder with a hole cut through it, and stamped on the outside of the cylinder would have been his name and some other symbols, so that when he was engaged in business and he needed to put his mark on an official document, he could roll that seal over clay, and it would make his name on the clay, and then the clay would dry hard. There's a cord, so he would have been wearing that around his neck. His staff probably also had a mark on the head of it that identified him personally, sort of like an ancient Near Eastern credit card, okay? So basically what she says is, give me all your credit cards. And he said, okay, pulls out his wallet and gives them to her. Guy's not thinking with his head. He's foolish. And she gets pregnant. So now what's going to happen? Verse 19. She left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. She didn't intend to live as a prostitute. This was something that she was doing on purpose. There was no legal redress for her. She was trapped. She was trapped by the position that she had been put in by Judah, and he had shown no indication whatsoever to help her out. And so she has taken matters into her own hands. Very dark, immoral story as it unfolds. You know, Focus on the Family got under fire this week for doing a review of 50 Shades of Grey. Did you notice that? So I guess somebody had to read the book, somebody had to go watch the movie. A lot of people are saying, you guys don't need to be doing that. But I'm a little surprised, and I haven't read the book, haven't seen the movie, just want to make sure you know that. I have no intention of doing so, okay? But I at least read a description of the story so that I know what it's about. And I'm shocked. You know, here's a story that is about a man who abuses, manipulates a young woman and exploits her, and everybody's rushing out to see it, and I'm scratching my head and thinking, what did I miss? Wasn't it just a few weeks ago that everybody was all angry at Ray Rice because of domestic abuse of a woman and ready to throw him off the ship so that he could drown in the ocean of culture? and be lost and forgotten forever. And now suddenly we're all running out and want to see the movie and read the book, and women are saying, oh, it helps me to explore my dark side. And I'm thinking, what about the light? What about getting rid of your dark sides? Why are you even admitting you have a dark side? Why do you want to explore your dark sides? And some women say, oh, but it's helped my marriage. My marriage was dying, and now I can have sex again. And I'm thinking to myself, isn't that kind of like robbing the bank to pay off your credit cards? You may get your cards paid off, but you're still in trouble. There's still going to be a day of reckoning that comes at some point. You cannot base a marriage on sexual immorality. It can't be done. It's a broken foundation. And you can build a beautiful house on it, or so you think you have, but the minute the earth shifts, what's going to happen? The house is coming down. Folks, if you haven't already learned this, sin always offers some kind of temporary pleasure. It always does. That's why people get trapped in it. If sin didn't offer anything at all, then there wouldn't be so many people entangled in it. There is a beautiful door and a nice looking facade on the outside of sin, and when you come up to it, it seems very nice, and it makes a lot of promises, and for a while it may even seem like that it's paying off, but eventually you find out the dark side. And why anybody wants to explore that is beyond me. So Judah is struggling here with sexual sin. Humanity has struggled with sexual sin and will continue to do so, but we don't have to. We don't have to. Here's the next thing. What did Judah do wrong? Well, he surrendered to sexual immorality. He surrendered to sexual immorality. Please don't do that. Verse 20. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adulamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman. But he didn't find her. He asked the men who lived there, where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim? There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here, they said. Now, she's gone from being a Zona prostitute to being a Kadesha, which the NIV calls shrine prostitute, but really Kadesha just means holy woman. Isn't that weird? It's as if the Adulamite Hira he's changed he's changed the terminology here to kind of elevate things a little bit. Oh, she's not just a Zona. No, she's a Kadesha. She's not a prostitute. She's a holy woman. Yeah, right. A prostitute by any other name. Sexual immorality by any other name. Yeah, we've done the same kind of thing today. It's amazing to me what words have dropped out of use. If you ever read the King James Version of the Bible, there's one word you find out is gone from our culture today. There's quite a few in there that are gone, but this one's interesting. It's the word fornication. Have you ever noticed that? You know, people just don't use fornication much anymore. When you're talking to people around the water cooler and at work, what are you going to do this weekend? I think I'm going to go out and fornicate. You know, it's just, people don't use that word. Because we don't think of sexual immorality as being a bad thing. Oh, I'm going to go see my girlfriend. Girlfriend? Really? That you're sleeping with? Is that what we call her now? Is that what we call it? But words change, and they played the same games back then. Oh, no, not a Zona. She was a Kadesha. Yeah, she's a holy woman. A holy woman. That's why the NIV uses shrine prostitute and get some other things from the English translations, because it was related to what they considered to be worship, nature worship. That they would worship before Baal and have sex, and he would give them fertility, and their crops would come in. Verse 22. So he went back to Judah, and he said, I didn't find her. By the way, why is Hira doing this? Why isn't Judah doing it? Is he ashamed of what he did? Why didn't he go back and get his pledge? Verse 22. So he went back to Judah and he said, I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said, there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here. Then Judah said, well, let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. I don't know where the we comes from. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her. In other words, I tried. He's lost his credit cards, but he can't He can't do any more because he's going to bring some attention to himself. Verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution. And as a result, she is now pregnant. Judah said, bring her out here and have her burned to death. Woo! My goodness. Now, apparently what Judah's doing here is stepping in for his son, Shelah. You know, he was happy for Tamar to cool her heels over there and be completely forgotten about when he thought she was a curse. But when she ends up being pregnant, suddenly he's all worried about the honor of his family and the honor of his third son. And he wants her to be burned to death. No trial, no chance for her to speak. What about the double standard here? He can run around and have sex with anybody that he wants to, as long as he pays a goat. Right? And Jesus seemed to say something about this. What was that? What was that? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Before you try to help somebody else get the what out of your eye, then you better get the what out of your eye? The plank. I think Judah's walking around with a plank in his eye. Okay? I think so. You know, in the Old Testament, if Tamar did commit adultery, the Old Testament, later on, Mosaic legislation said that not only was she worthy of death, but guess what? Judah was too. Of course, he doesn't realize that yet. He doesn't realize that. So what did Judah do wrong? Here's the last thing on that part. He showed judgment without mercy. And we have to be very, very careful about this because the Bible says that when we show judgment without mercy, guess what happens? We get judgment without mercy. So we want to be merciful every chance we get because we want God to show us mercy. Verse 25, as she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law, I am pregnant by the man who owns these. Well, now we see she has laid a very thoughtful and careful trap, hasn't she? She added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. Judah recognized him and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah, and he did not sleep with her again. And didn't burn her to death either, by the way. Changed his mind. Now, he's not saying here that prostitution is righteous. That's not the issue. Later in the Bible, through the prophet Hosea, God says, I will not punish your daughters when they turn to prostitution, nor your daughters-in-law when they commit adultery, because the men themselves consort with harlots and sacrifice to the shrine prostitutes, and people without understanding will come to ruin. In other words, he's saying, as long as you guys are out there paying for it, then don't point your finger at the women. So Judah realizes his lack of righteousness here, and he does an amazing thing. He repents. He repents. He admits that he's wrong, and he doesn't just repent with his words. The reason that that phrase is, and he did not sleep with her again, the reason that phrase is there is to show us that there were actions that followed his words. Biblical repentance always includes some kind of action. We can say the words all we want to, but if it doesn't change the way we live our life, the words are meaningless. He didn't sleep with her again. This is the beginning of Judah's spiritual transformation. And as we go through the rest of Genesis, Judah's going to come up again. It's going to be amazing what God does in his life. Matt Buckland was recruiting programmers earlier this week for Forward Partners. He was on his way to work in the subway, and a guy bumped into him. Actually, Matt kind of got his way, and they bumped into each other, and the guy said some rather unkind things. Rather unkind. I wouldn't repeat them, okay? Very unkind things to Matt. And then they both went their separate ways. Well, lo and behold, later in the day, as Matt was interviewing people for programmers, guess who shows up looking for a job? That's right. Oh, and by the way, in case you're wondering, he didn't get the job. Our sins have a way of what? Finding us out. Yeah, Judah's just rocking along thinking that he's got it all in hand. And Tamar rocked his world. And it really wasn't Tamar, it was God. God was rocking his world with the things that she did. What did Judah do right? Write this down on your outline. What did Judah do right? He admitted his mistake. First thing that we always have to do with God is we have to be willing to admit our mistake. Till we can do that, nothing else is going to happen. That is a barricade, that's a block to any kind of spiritual growth. It's the block to our salvation at the beginning until we repent. And every time we come up against something that we're struggling with, until we are willing to admit that we've done something wrong, it blocks us. He admitted his mistake, and secondly, he changed his behavior. He changed his behavior. Verse 27. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. Judah's father Jacob was a twin. Apparently twins run in the family. Verse 28, as she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand, so the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, this one came out first. The marker was because the firstborn gets the double portion, right? And so it's very important in these families to know who came out first. But look what happens, verse 29. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out. And she said, the midwife, so this is how you've broken out. So his name was Perez, which sounds in Hebrew like broken out. And there's always these strange things that happen in births. Several times in the book of Genesis. Verse 30, then his brother, who had a scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was given the name Zerah. Zerah was technically the firstborn because his arm came out first, but Perez came out before him. Kind of like God chose Abel over Cain, the way he chose Isaac over Ishmael, the way he chose Jacob over Esau. We keep having this theme keeps happening in the book of Genesis where the younger gets chosen over the older, and it's going to come up again. And it's going to come up later in the Bible when they're looking for a king. And they come to a certain household, and they look at all the brothers. And the brothers are impressive. But the man who's been sent there by God keeps saying, no, not that one. No, not that one. No, not that one. No, not that one. He goes through all the brothers and eventually asks, well, don't you have any other sons? He says, well, yeah, there's the runt out in the field. But surely you're not looking for him. But guess what? It was David. David. King David. And guess whose ancestor is in this story? David's. Perez is the ancestor of King David. And that's one of the points that we're supposed to get as we read through this is, oh, wow. So that's where Perez came from. What a strange story. What a kind of a dark story, actually. And yet in the midst of all of that, there's some light when Judah finally realizes that he needs to repent. And he's blessed by God. So here's the last thing. How did God bless Judah? How did God bless Judah? His family gave birth to God's king. Now that's a double entendre, by the way, because there were two kings. His family gave birth to Judah. The tribe of Judah gave birth to King David. But the tribe of Judah also gave birth to King whom? King Jesus. That's right. So we're looking at the line here that ends up with Jesus. And if you were to open your New Testament and look at Matthew chapter 1, you would see Perez's name right there. And Tamar. Right? So Judah gets to be a part of the big story. You know, you saw the news not too long ago from Ferguson, Missouri, when a young black man had an altercation with a white police officer, and unfortunately the young man ended up dead. And then, of course, the obligatory racial riots began, and the national news came in and stirred it up even more, and activists came in from out of town and made things even worse. It was horrible to watch. Heartbreaking. But there's always a story behind the story. A story behind the story. And the untold story, at least one of the untold stories of Ferguson, Missouri, was the chaplains of Franklin Graham. You know who Franklin Graham is, right? The son of Billy Graham. Very busy in ministry. And Franklin Graham took 80 chaplains into Ferguson, Missouri. I know you didn't see this in the news, and you never will. Took 80 chaplains into Franklin, Missouri, and they began to pray and minister to people on the street, to the police officers. They didn't choose sides. They just ministered to everybody. Whoever was in pain, whoever was ready for some prayer, some ministry, they ministered to them, and they prayed with 1,500 people over a period of about 6 or 8 weeks. And because of that, almost 100 people made decisions for Jesus Christ. So in the midst of all that craziness that while we were watching on the news, God was using that for people to get saved. For people to get saved. And at that time, there was a couple that they talked to, this couple that you see right there, and they had 5 children, and they had been living together, and as a result of all the craziness in Ferguson, they lost everything in a fire. And they came to the chaplains, and they began to talk to them and pray, and when they heard about Jesus, they decided it was time to give their life to Christ. Both of them got saved. And then they realized, we need to be married. And so they asked the chaplains, is there somebody here who can marry us? And they said, well, we'll find somebody. And they found a local pastor who did some premarital counseling with them, talked to them, and then they had a wedding ceremony. That's it. There they are, getting married. A very simple, Christ-centered wedding ceremony. And so now they're ready to raise their 5 children in the Lord. In the Lord. Now they're ready to be part of God's story. Who knows what God will use it for. But we have to reach a point, don't we, where we realize that there's something bigger going on. And we've got to do it God's way. Judah reached that point. We need God's design in our life so that we can be a part of God's story. Would you pray with me for just a moment? Have you reached a point yet in your life